The wind on Silas's land spoke a language of solitude. It was a lonely dialect, whispering through the tall, sun-bleached grass and rattling the dry bones of the cottonwood trees that stood skeletal guard along the creek bed. For 10 years, he had been its sole student, learning its every nuance of grief and endurance. His ranch was a kingdom of one, its borders defined by fences he maintained with grim diligence, and its heart a small, sturdy cabin that smelled of pine, old leather, and the lingering ghost of wood smoke. Inside, every object had its place, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials, a rifle cleaned and oiled above the mantel, a worn leather-bound book on the nightstand, a single tin cup hanging from a nail by the stone hearth. This was not a life of peace, but of truce. A ceasefire with a past that had stormed his world and taken everything. He didn't speak her name, not even to the wind. Maria. The memory of her was a locked room inside him, and he had long ago thrown away the key. He rose with the sun and slept when it fell, his days measured by the hard, honest labor of a man determined to outwork his own sorrow. The world beyond his fences, with its noise and its chaos and its demands, could crumble to dust for all he cared. He had built his fortress against feeling, and for a decade, its walls had held. Until the night the storm came, and with it, them. They appeared like phantoms at the edge of his porch light, 3 women huddled together against the first fat, cold drops of rain. They were not just women, they were vessels of life, their forms made round and heavy with child. The eldest, her face a mask of fierce desperation, stood slightly ahead of the other 2. The one in the middle trembled visibly, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to go far beyond the brewing tempest. The youngest clutched the eldest's arm, her gaze fixed on Silas with a plea so raw it bypassed his defenses and struck something deep and dormant within him. His first instinct, sharp and cold as the coming rain, was to refuse. To point them down the road and shut the door on the trouble they so obviously carried. They were a disruption. A complication. A crack in the armor he had so painstakingly forged. But as the lightning split the sky, illuminating their exhausted faces and the unmistakable swell of their bellies, the locked room in his soul creaked open. He saw Maria, her face radiant in the final weeks, her hands resting on the impossible curve of her own stomach. The memory was an ambush, a clean, sharp pain that stole his breath. He saw the hope he'd once had, the future he'd once planned, all of it swept away by a torrent of brown water and broken promises. He looked at the 3 women, drenched and desperate, and saw not strangers, but an echo of his own lost story. What is a man if not the sum of his choices? And in that moment, standing on the precipice of their fate and his own carefully constructed solitude, Silas knew he was facing a choice that mattered more than any he had made in 10 years. He grunted, a sound that was less a word and more a surrender, and stepped back from the door. "In," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Get in before you're washed away." He didn't offer comfort, only shelter. He didn't ask questions, only gestured towards the fire. But as they shuffled past him, bringing the scent of rain and fear into his sterile sanctuary, Silas felt the foundations of his world shift. The walls of his fortress had not fallen, but the gate had just been thrown wide open. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible blue and the clean, earthy scent of damp soil. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere was still heavy with unspoken anxieties. Silas had given the women his own bed, sleeping on a cot by the dying embers of the hearth. He rose before them, rekindling the fire, brewing coffee whose bitter aroma was the only familiar comfort in a suddenly alien space. He watched them as they woke, moving with the careful, cumbersome grace of late pregnancy. The eldest, who introduced herself as Elara, had a leader's watchfulness. She met his gaze directly, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wary appraisal. The middle sister, Lyra, started at every sound, the pop of the fire, the creak of a floorboard, her hands fluttering protectively over her belly. The youngest, Cassia, possessed a fragile optimism, offering him a small, hesitant smile that felt like a flicker of sunlight in the dim cabin. He gave them food, biscuits and jerky, and they ate with a hunger that spoke of days on the run. The silence between them was a chasm, filled only with the things they were too afraid to say. Silas didn't press. He understood that some stories are too heavy to be offered freely, they must be earned. Instead, he turned to his work. He went out to mend a section of fence damaged by the storm, the familiar rhythm of stretching wire and pounding posts away to process the seismic shift in his life. But his work was different now. Before, the fence was to keep the world out. Today, as he cinched the wire tight, he realized he was trying to keep something safe within. From the rise of the hill where he worked, he could see the vast, empty expanse of the valley. It was beautiful and brutal, a land that gave and took in equal measure. And then he saw it. A speck on the horizon. A rider, moving with purpose, tracking the line of the creek that ran past Silas's property. His blood ran cold. He knew the gait of that horse, the cut of the man's silhouette. It was one of Jedediah Thorne's men. Thorne. The name was a curse in this valley, a synonym for greed and power. He was a land baron who owned nearly everything from the river to the mountains, including the politicians and the law. And he was the man whose shoddy, cost-cutting construction of the Red Creek Dam 10 years ago had failed during a spring flood, unleashing the wall of water that had claimed Maria's life as she drove home from town. The sight of Thorne's man sent a jolt of ice and fire through Silas's veins. He looked back at the cabin, where 3 pregnant women were hiding, and the shape of their trouble began to sharpen into a terrifying image. He finished his work with grim speed and headed back. As he approached, he saw Lyra by the window, her face pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame. She had seen the rider, too. When the man reached his gate, Silas met him there, his stance casual but his body coiled like a spring. The rider, a hard-faced man named Cale, nodded curtly. "Silas. Ain't seen you in a dog's age and my days have been better for it," Silas replied, his voice flat. Cale's eye scanned past him, towards the cabin. "Heard some folks might have passed this way. 3 of them. Women." Silas held his gaze. A lie felt foreign on his tongue, but it came out with the force of necessity. "Just me and the ghosts out here, Cale." Same as always. Cale squinted, unconvinced, but knew better than to push the brooding recluse. He grunted, turned his horse, and rode off. Silas watched him go, every instinct screaming that this was not an end, but a beginning. He had lied. He had chosen a side. The trouble was no longer just at his door, he had invited it in and barred the door behind it. He was now part of their story. He turned back to the cabin, the weight of his decision settling upon him. The past was no longer a memory. It was a living, breathing threat, and it was riding straight for him. When the past comes knocking, not as a memory but as a living threat, do you barricade the door or do you finally answer? What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments. Silas knew he had already answered. He had chosen to stand, not for a memory, but for the fragile, nascent life that now sheltered under his roof. The sight of Thorne's rider was the stone that shattered the sisters' fragile composure. The lie Silas told at the gate had bought them time, but it had also solidified their shared danger. That evening, as the shadows grew long and painted the valley in hues of bruised purple and orange, Ilara finally broke their silence. She sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Silas had brewed, her knuckles white. Lyra and Cassius sat beside her, a trinity of fear and exhaustion. "His name is Jedediah Thorne," Ilara began, her voice low and strained, as if the name itself was a physical weight. Silas stood by the hearth, his back to them, stacking firewood. He did not turn, but every line of his body was rigid with attention. "Our father was a sharecropper on his land. When he passed, he left behind debts. Thorne, he doesn't forgive debts. He collects." She explained their situation in stark, horrifying detail. They were indentured, little more than property to a man who saw people as assets. Thorne was a widower with 3 grown, brutish sons, and he was obsessed with his legacy. With no wives of their own, Thorne decreed that his sons would take the 3 sisters. It wasn't a proposal, it was a proclamation. A claiming of breeding stock. They were to be vessels for the next generation of Thornes, their lives, and the lives of their unborn children forfeited to his dynastic ambitions. They fled in the dead of night the moment they knew they were all pregnant, realizing that to stay meant surrendering their children to a monstrous fate. "He will not stop," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. He sees us as his. Our children as his. Silas finally turned, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. The name Thorn had been a hot coal in his gut since he saw the rider. Now, hearing their story, it burst into flame. This wasn't a random act of cruelty he had stumbled into, it was the same dark force, the same callous disregard for human life that had shattered his own world. Thorn hadn't just built a faulty dam, he built his entire empire on the wreckage of other people's lives. The death of his Maria wasn't an accident, it was a consequence of a rot that ran to the very core of the man. Suddenly, the fight for these women became inseparable from the fight he had never had for his wife. The grief he had buried for a decade unearthed itself, not as sorrow, but as a cold, clarifying rage. "He will not have you," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they resonated in the small cabin with the finality of an oath. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within him. The hermit was gone, replaced by the protector. The man who had hidden from the world was now preparing to face its ugliest part. The next days were a transformation. Silas's movements took on a new purpose. He was no longer just maintaining his solitude, he was fortifying a sanctuary. He checked the sight on his rifle, inventoried his ammunition, and walked the perimeter of his land, memorizing every rock, every dip in the terrain that could be used for cover. His silence became less about distance and more about focus. He started teaching the sisters, not just how to hide, but how to be strong. He showed Ilara how to load the spare shotgun, her hands clumsy at first, then steady. He taught Lyra how to listen to the sounds of the valley, to distinguish the call of a hawk from the snap of a twig under a heavy boot. He showed Cassie which herbs from his small garden could be brewed into calming teas and which could be used to treat a fever. He was giving them agency, turning their fear into a tool. One evening, as he and Ilara sat on the porch watching the stars begin to prick the velvet darkness, she looked at him. "You hate him, too," she stated, not a question. "Why?" For the first time in 10 years, Silas spoke of it. He didn't tell her the whole story, not yet. But he gave her a piece of his pain. "He builds things that break," Silas said, his gaze lost in the vastness of the night sky. "And he never stays to count the cost." He spoke Maria's name, just once, a soft utterance that felt both like a betrayal of his grief and a reclamation of his love. A bridge was being built between them, a fragile structure made of shared pain and a desperate, burgeoning hope. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was becoming a home, its hearth the center of a new, unlikely family forged in the crucible of fear and defiance. The air grew heavy and still in the days that followed, pregnant with the inevitability of confrontation. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue, but on the ground, a siege was coming. It began not with a thunder of hooves, but with a quiet, menacing presence. 2 of Thorn's men on a distant ridge, then a third circling to the west. They weren't attacking. They were corralling, cutting off the world, turning Silas's ranch into an island. They were waiting for their master. He arrived on the 4th day, not with an army, but with a chilling, theatrical arrogance. Jedediah Thorn rode up to the gate alone, his 3 hulking sons fanned out behind him at a respectful distance. He was a man accustomed to power, dressed in a fine coat that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He sat atop his horse like a king surveying his domain, and his gaze on the cabin was one of possessive, reptilian coldness. Silas met him on the porch, shotgun held loosely but ready at his side. The 3 sisters were inside, the door bolted. They were not cowering. Ilara had the spare rifle, Lyra a pot of boiling water on the stove, and Cassie was ready with bandages and supplies. They were a unit, a bastion of quiet defiance. "Silas," Thorn called out, his voice smooth and coated in false congeniality. "It's been a long time. I see you've taken in some strays. I've come to collect my property." The word property hung in the air, vile and obscene. "They're not property," Silas answered, his voice a low growl. "They're people. And this is my land." "You're not welcome here," Thorn chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Your land?" "Silas, everything the sun touches in this valley is my land, one way or another. I thought you'd have learned that by now. He dismounted, walking slowly towards the porch, his eyes glinting with malice. I heard about what happened to your wife. Maria, wasn't it? A tragedy. The creek rises, things get washed away. It's the way of the world. The casual cruelty of the words was a deliberate poison, meant to unman him. But it had the opposite effect. It solidified Silas's resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. Some things aren't washed away, Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Some things are broken by men who are too cheap to build them right. Thorn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. You always were a bitter man, Silas. Hiding out here, nursing old wounds. A real man would have moved on. A real man builds a legacy. He gestured back to his sons. That's what they carry. My future. My bloodline. I've come for what is mine. You've come for nothing, Silas stated, raising the shotgun. Turn around and ride away. The standoff stretched into an eternity. The air was thick enough to taste. Then, one of Thorn's sons, impatient and brutish, drew his pistol. It was the only excuse Silas needed. The blast from his shotgun was deafening, not aimed at the man, but at the ground by his feet, kicking up a shower of dirt and rock. Chaos erupted. Thorn's men, who had been waiting on the ridges, spurred their horses forward. The fight was not a prolonged battle, but a swift, brutal ballet of strategy. Silas was not a brawler, he was a hunter. He used every inch of the land he knew so well. He moved from the porch to the barn, from the barn to the creek bed, a phantom of righteous fury. The sisters were his eyes, calling out positions from the cabin windows. It was a symphony of resistance. The climax came when Silas, having systematically disabled and disarmed Thorn's men, finally faced the Baron himself near the old cottonwood tree. Thorn, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage, lunged at him. The fight was raw and primal. It was not for land or for women, but for a fundamental principle. It was the clash of two opposing worlds, one of callous entitlement, the other of hard-won integrity. Silas, fueled by a decade of suppressed grief and a newfound purpose, was stronger. He slammed Thorn against the trunk of the tree, the man's arrogant facade crumbling to reveal the coward beneath. You don't just take, Silas roared, his face inches from Thorn's, his voice breaking with the agony of 10 years. You shatter. And you never even look at the pieces. He didn't kill him. Death would have been too simple an escape. Instead, he broke him. He held the humiliated, defeated man there until the sheriff, summoned by a neighbor who'd heard the shots, finally arrived. The law, a concept Thorn had always considered beneath him, had finally come to claim him. As they led him and his sons away in cuffs, the great Jedediah Thorn looked small, a pathetic tyrant stripped of his power, his legacy turning to dust before his very eyes. In the aftermath of the storm, there is a profound quiet. The dust settled over the ranch, and the only sounds were the tired breathing of its defenders and the gentle sigh of the wind, which no longer sounded lonely. The air, once thick with menace, was now clean and light. Thorn was gone, his power broken, his name now a synonym not for fear, but for failure. Inside the cabin, the tension finally snapped, releasing a wave of exhausted tears and shuddering relief. Elara, Lyra, and Cassia didn't just see Silas as a savior, they saw him as family. And Silas, looking at the three women who had inadvertently forced him back into the world of the living, felt the frozen continent of his grief finally begin to thaw. The weeks that followed were not about defense, but about creation. The ranch, for so long a monument to a past that was lost, became a cradle for a future that was just beginning. The rhythms of life returned, but they were different now. They were punctuated not by the solitary tasks of a man alone, but by the shared duties of a burgeoning family. Silas taught Elara how to manage the ranch's finances, discovering she had a sharp mind for numbers. He worked with Lyra in the garden, her anxious energy finding a calming outlet in the nurturing of new life from the soil. He sat with Cassie on the porch, listening as she quietly sang old lullabies to her belly, her gentle hope a balm for his own scarred heart. Then, as the seasons turned, life burst forth. Lyra was first, giving birth to a healthy, squalling boy with a shock of dark hair. Silas, the man who had thought he would never again hold a child, found his rough, calloused hands cradling the infant with a tenderness that surprised even himself. 2 weeks later, Cassia delivered a daughter, her eyes the same deep blue as the morning sky. And finally, Ilara brought another boy into the world, strong and steady just like his mother. The silence of the ranch was shattered forever, replaced by the symphony of life, of crying and cooing, of laughter and lullabies. The cabin, once a hollow echo chamber of loss, was now filled to the brim with a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful warmth. Years passed, flowing like the clear water in the creek that Thorn's greed had once threatened. The story of the recluse cowboy and the 3 sisters became a quiet legend in the valley, a modern parable of courage and redemption. The ranch thrived. Under the shared guidance of Silas and the sisters, it became a prosperous and welcoming place. The children, 2 boys and a girl who knew only this wild, beautiful land as home, grew up with mud on their boots and sunshine in their hair. They called him Grandpa Si, their small hands fitting perfectly into his large one. He taught them how to read the clouds, how to understand the language of the horses, and how to build things that last. He watched them play beneath the same cottonwood tree where he had confronted his past, and he saw not a specter of violence, but a symbol of resilience. The tree had weathered its own storms, and now it provided shade for a new generation. Silas had found peace, but it was not the quiet, sterile peace of solitude he had once sought. It was a loud, messy, and infinitely more profound peace, built on the foundations of shared struggle and unconditional love. He had honored Maria's memory not by locking his heart away in a fortress of grief, but by throwing open the gates and allowing his deepest wound to become a bridge to a new life, a new family, and a new beginning. He had learned that the truest legacy isn't what you own or what you build, but who you shelter from the storm. Silas's story teaches us that the deepest wounds can sometimes build the strongest bridges. His cabin, once a fortress built to keep the world out, became a sanctuary because he made one choice, the choice to let others in. He thought he was offering them shelter, but in the end, they were the ones who rescued him from the prison of his own past. It reminds us that family isn't always the one we are born into, but the one we build through acts of courage, kindness, and shared humanity. The world can be a harsh and unforgiving place, but a single act of compassion can ripple outwards, creating a safe harbor where new life and new hope can take root. We all face our own storms and our own ghosts. So, we want to ask you, what does home mean to you? Is it a place, a person, or a feeling? Have you ever found family in an unexpected place, or been the unexpected family for someone else? Share your stories in the comments below. We truly do read every single one, and your experiences are a powerful reminder that we are all connected. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. We are dedicated to telling stories that matter, stories that inspire and remind us of the incredible strength of the human spirit. You won't want to miss what we have in store. Thank you for watching.